My name is John Root, and this program is sponsored in part by a grant from the Berlin Cultural Council and also is being supported by the Berlin Public Library. So,
Friends of the Library, I will mention.
excuse me?
Friends of the Library.
Friends of the Library, there you go.
Just want to give them
Friends of the Berlin
due.
Public Library, that's right. Give credit where credit is due. Now, this is a subject that I have some passion about, edible perennial gardening and landscaping. And I'm wondering what brought you here. Does anyone want to share either what you're already doing on your property that in the way of perennial edibles, or what your interests are?
I'm just trying to get rid of some weeds.
Trying to get rid of some weeds. Well, that's always a noble endeavor. Right. Anyone else? Do you already have some things growing?
Yeah. Blueberries.
Blueberries, great. Do you get any, or do the birds get them all?
This is the year I bought some net.
Good for you.
But I also bought some more blueberry bushes because I'm willing to share.
Great.
And strawberries.
Okay, all right, okay.
I do herbs.
Excuse me?
Herbs.
Herbs, okay, yeah. Well, that's magnanimous of you to be willing to share blueberries with the birds. But, so on with the show, and so should we call this dirt or soil? Well, I think of dirt as just being inert, and I think of soil as being alive. So what is soil alive with? Well, all the things that when I was young we were taught were bad. You know, the bacteria, the fungi, in short, germs, right? Well, it turns out that germs, a lot of germs, are actually quite good and in fact essential for the health of your soil. So let's look at the soil food web here. And it's all about organics, organic matter that's being decomposed by those heroes of the soil, the bacteria, the fungi, actinomycetes, and all the things that are microscopic or not quite microscopic, or, you know, earthworms and on up. And that's what, these are all being cycled among themselves. One is eating the other, or the excretions of one become food for the other. And all of it is the available nutrients for the soil roots. And without it, soil roots have a hard time getting any of it, as we will see. So here's a real MD who says that she talks about something called the farm effect. Daphne Miller says that, and evidently research has shown that people are healthier if they live on farms or have regular exposure to gardening and farm work. And she says that time spent working in the soil is a means to build community, improve strength and fitness, slow dementia in seniors, improve school performance in teens. So she gets out a prescription pad and writes, spend more time outside and gardening too. And here's someone else who has done extensive research both about children, and the book you wrote was Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature. He also wrote a book more recently called The Nature Principle, and that's about the rest of us. And what he's saying is that just humans in general need this connection and for our overall well-being. And to have a connection with the earth is just, it's quite satisfying, it's comforting, it's reassuring, it's stimulating, all kinds of things that are intangibles and yet that are so important. And right from the World Wide Web here, we have some amazing facts. One, and this perhaps is more of a theory, but it's a believable theory that perhaps people who aren't exposed to dirt and soil enough might be more susceptible to things like asthma and allergies because their bodies haven't had the chance to develop antibodies and defenses. And more surprising, there's this soil bacterium called Mycobacterium vaccae that may be able to alleviate depression. How in the world, you wonder, could a bacterium do that? Well, lung cancer patients who are injected with this killed M. vaccae reported better quality of life, less nausea and pain. And when injected into mice, it activates a set of serotonin-releasing neurons. And that's, if you're up on your medication, your pharmaceuticals, you know that serotonin is what makes us happy, basically. And here's a bacterium that can do that very thing. It acts just like, targeting the same nerves that Prozac targets. So how about that? It's not as if people are actually prescribing this bacterium yet, and yet maybe they will. But at any rate, let's get up close and personal with the root of a plant. This is a root in cross section, and this is the exterior of the root. And what you have here, see these little fuzzy things? What you have is the fungus, these little threads of fungus that are surrounding the root. Now you might think, oh my goodness, watch out. Shouldn't the root be nice and free of fungi? The opposite is true. The root is actually leaking sugars, exuding sugars, the products of its photosynthesis, in order to invite the fungi to surround the root, and in this case, even to penetrate the root into the very cells of the root. Now, what in the world is going on here? Mycorrhizal fungi. Myco means fungus, rhizal means root. It's a symbiosis. And what good could they possibly do to the plant roots? Well, a lot of good. They bring water, which of course is critical for roots, and dissolve nutrients. And they bring far more water and dissolved nutrients to the roots than the roots by themselves would ever be able to dissolve with their own circularity. In other words, it's a super expanded root system, if you want to think of it that way. And in return, what do the roots do? They feed the fungi. They feed them the energy, those sugars, the energy. Here it is, an actual photograph, micro electron microscopy gives us a glimpse of this world in which the root is totally penetrated by these sheaths of fungi. Now, this should be front page news. 1996 now, it's not even 20 years ago, Sarah Wright, working in Beltsville, Maryland, discovered that up until that time, it was thought that humus, you've heard about humus, right? And I'm sure you all have a good sense of humus. So what is humus? Humus is the decomposing plant matter that is fairly inert after it's, after a certain amount of composition, it stays as humus, and it's basically a reservoir of carbon, and it gives the soil tilth. Tilth is how a farmer in a garden can just feel the soil, and they feel, yes, it's got all that, it has a nice crumbly texture, and it was thought that humus was the main reservoir of carbon. Well, now it's known that glomalin is a much larger reservoir of carbon, because you see these fungal filaments are growing, and they make their sheaths to protect themselves and to give themselves rigidity to span, the gaps between these little soil particles. So they're binding the soil together. That's why this is called the soil superglue. And the bodies of these, actually, it's kind of like a tree trunk. The inner part of a tree is dead. All those cells inside a tree are dead. The same is true for the sheaths or the armor that the fungus creates for itself. The sheaths are just binding the soil. The hyphae inside them die after a few weeks, but those sheaths, those of armor, live on, and they have more carbon in them than humus itself. And in fact, they're even protecting the humus itself from further degradation. So they're such important, just in terms of the carbon sequestration, in this day and age, we think, this should be on the front page, right? Because if soils are rich in glomalin and humus, they can sequester carbon from the air. And look at all the other things, the wonderful things that glomalin, the soil superglue, is capable of doing. The tilth, I mentioned protecting humus, resisting erosion, creating porosity in the soil, harboring beneficial microbes, holding water, resisting crusting, defenses against degradation, boost productivity, and this stuff refuses to decompose. Lasts for 7 to 42 years. So, now, permaculture is a term that was coined by this Australian author, David Holmgren, and Bill Mollison, another Australian. The two of them together have traveled the globe many times giving workshops about this concept of gardening like nature. In other words, when we do agriculture, instead of having a row of, many rows of corn or wheat or whatever you're planting, and it's called a monoculture when you do that, why not garden more like nature? Instead of starting new every year with plants that only grow for that year and then you harvest them and that's it. That's not how nature does things, is it? Nature has every kind of vegetation: trees, shrubs, vines, canes, herbaceous perennials, and the weeds. What we're growing for crops are really super weeds, but they actually play a fairly minor role. Only in disturbed soil are they able to even survive. So the health of the ecosphere now might well depend upon what's being called permaculture or permanent agriculture, combination of this. And sometimes permaculture is seen as being permanent culture. Anything, in other words, anything that's sustainable, not just the agriculture, but every part of what we're doing. And after all, everything we do from this point on needs to be more and more sustainable if we want to pass this planet on in a habitable condition. And that's why Becky and Bill Wilson from Midwest Permaculture feel as strongly as they do about basically, we need to do the responsible thing, and we need to realize that we have the responsibility for creating these permanent cultures or permanent permaculture in the world upon which we all live. And they say that permaculture design then can do just about everything that needs to be done, providing energy as well as building topsoil and fertility, reviving our local economies, creating prosperity, and employing just about everybody. Now we're going to have an economic system that has the triple bottom line. Instead of just the profit being the bottom line, we need to add planet and people and make those actually more important than the profits themselves. So here are a couple of guys who, this fellow's name is Jonathan Bates. Here's Eric Tomsmeyer. They bought a duplex in Holyoke, an urban environment that had a barren backyard and a barren front yard, and they turned it into an oasis. And they were bachelors when they bought it, but they were hoping for something better in their lives, and sure enough. So this story, Paradise Lot, is actually a romance as well as a story of how they built their edible forest garden. Here's a view into their backyard. And they give tours, and there's so much diversity there. There are just dozens and dozens of different kinds of plants. Not all of them, by the way, are planted for produce, although many certainly are, but others are what you might think of as companion plants that are helping those plants to survive. So let's look at the advantages of permaculture or an edible landscape. It certainly is beautiful, isn't it? Compare that, what you're looking at on this tiny scrap of land here. But look at just the abundance and it's just so vibrant and so welcoming. It's effective too, it works. Species diversity, there are so many plants there. The prolonged harvest means that if you had perennials now in your garden, in your vegetable garden, let's say, you would already have been feasting on them for weeks now. So, and many of us haven't even begun to put our annuals in, or perhaps we've seeded some cold hardy plants or what have you. But if you restrict yourself to annual gardening, much as I love a lot of those plants myself, I'll take tomatoes and squash and beans, and they're good. But there's so many more choices, and you certainly extend your harvest. You can be harvesting earlier and later, and of course you'll have a larger palette of tastes to choose from when you go to the table. And I think that's important for those of us who are trying to go in the direction of sustainable eating. It's not just about growing local, although that's very important, but another part of it is how high on the food chain are we eating? And the more the citizens of the world move towards vegetarianism or even veganism, the better off we are, because there's a huge carbon footprint involved in growing growing cattle and pigs especially, but chickens, just factory farming in general is not very kind for the animals, and there's questionable health in the meat that people eat, and questionable health about meat eating in general, no matter how healthy that meat is. So it's for the health of the planet and for our own health. If we can move in the direction of vegetarianism, well, the more vegetables we have to choose from, the more appealing that idea is, and the less that we would feel that we're sacrificing something. Okay, so. And these plants are resistant to pests, weather conditions, and other stresses more so than annuals. Tremendously productive. They provide wildlife habitat. I'm talking about beneficial wildlife here, not the groundhog that's going to eat everything up. We don't want to be providing habitat for him or her, do we? And ideally requiring much less labor and resources than an annual vegetable garden. So instead of all that plowing or rototilling at the beginning, instead of the weeding that you might have to do, how about your main job being harvesting? I like that idea. And maybe some pruning here and there, and maybe some mulching. But those are jobs that are not at all onerous. They're actually can be quite pleasing. So let's look at guild elements. The guild is an association, right? A planned association of plants together. It doesn't work for you just to, okay, let's just start from scratch and wipe the slate clean and let things move in. Whatever's wild, let it grow there, because what you'll find growing there is brambles, a multiflora rose, you'll find poison ivy, you'll find, the list goes on and on. Sweetbriar, a very invasive vine, autumn olive, another invasive vine. You know, what you want to do is you want to plan what's going to grow there and design it. And from an aerial view, you know, here's this tree, here's this shrub, and you know, maybe move things around and consider where the sunlight's coming from and all these things to think about until you have things where you want them to be. So those are your yield plants, the ones you're growing for food, fodder, fiber, fuel, pharmaceuticals, and for fun. But then you have these other plants that are going to help them out. The soil, the nitrogen fixers, by the way, fixing atmospheric nitrogen, the legumes do that, and so do some shrubs. They can actually use atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into organic matter. And so when those leaves and roots or whatever die, that's adding to the fertility of the soil, and they're really fertilizing themselves if you think about it. So the soil penetrators, dynamic accumulators, biomass producers, these are all about accessing the minerals, the nutrition that's in the soil, and then making it available in the organic, in the top layers, that is then going to be available to the roots of all of the plants in the system. Nectar suppliers and insect habitats are for the beneficial insects. Forage and fencing plants would be if you happen to have any animals like goats or chickens or the like. And speaking of animals, they can serve a positive function when they browse, scratch, and rub in places where you want them to. And they also certainly provide nutrients. And then they're the heroes of the show, the soil microbes. Unfortunately, this is too often what our landscape looks like. We grow more turf in this country than any crop, than any food crop. This is our major crop in this country. So we need to, and it's just not sustainable at all. We're spending a lot of money, time, and of course, there are negative environmental impacts, even if you don't add chemicals or irrigate or that sort of thing. You know, you're running the lawnmower and you're just underutilizing the productivity of your land. So, and if it's true that if you experience lawns to be too much trouble, TMT, and think about the expense, the average household spends $1,000 a year, $10,000 a decade. Well, what else could you do with that money or time, you know? And here's one option, which doesn't even, this is just, you know, providing habitat for insects and other wildlife. But isn't it beautiful, a wildlife meadow? And it's certainly demonstrated to be a lot less work and a lot less of a carbon footprint and a negative ecological impact over a 20-year period if you made that decision. But now let's think, you know, let's get down to business here. We want to grow some edible perennials. And are any of you familiar with this process called sheet mulching or lasagna gardening? Okay, so you can see what's happening. Kissing the lawn goodbye, as much of it as you're ready to, and of course you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to overextend yourself. I think gardeners will say this in general, that you want to think about, okay, how many hours am I going to devote per week to this project now and to the future, you know, and whatever maintenance. But the beginning part is the most labor intensive and the most the most investment in terms of money as well to buy the plants. But hopefully in the long run, you'll realize what a wonderful investment that was. So, cardboard, overlapping, okay? You want them to be overlapping by 6 inches. Or several layers thickness of newspaper does the same trick, okay? The grass and the weeds will not be able to grow through that. You're going to want to water, you know, hose down the cardboard or the newspapers, get them nice and wet, and then add some layers on top of that of whatever you happen to have on hand. In fact, you can even put something down before you put that cardboard and newspaper. Anything that might have weed seeds, like compost that has weed seeds, no problem. Put it under, you know, put it on the ground, and then you put the cardboard on top. Those weeds won't be able to germinate. But ideally, this layer of mulch will also keep your garden weed free. So the mulch can be, well, the leaves that you raked last year. It could be straw. It could be pine needles. Now some of you might be surprised to hear that. Don't pine needles make your soil acidic? It's actually a myth that pine needles make your soil acidic. As a matter of fact, both pine needles and oak leaves, which people also wonder about, they can be an excellent mulch because they don't decompose as readily, as quickly as some other kinds of mulch. And that can be a good thing because as soon as they decompose, well, that's fertile soil for the weed seeds to enter, which you want to prevent. And of course, mulch is also performing the function of keeping the soil moist and keeping it warm. Whatever you have, this is quite ambitious. This is about 20 inches worth of amendments here. It doesn't have to be that much. I mean, the simplest version, you wouldn't even have to use cardboard and newspaper necessarily. If you had a lot of leaves or dirt, for that matter, that you were able to import from some other place. The secret really is, what do you have available? What's spending as little money as possible and as little labor as possible. But you certainly can often get a lot of leaves from fall raking from either your own trees or neighbors when they put them out on the curb and in big bags. You ask them if you can have them, they'll say sure. And you could even use those bags themselves as part of your leaf sheet mulching. So composting is always a good idea to add fertility to the soil. But one thing you need to know about composting is that there needs to be twice as much carbon-rich as nitrogen-rich matter. Sometimes they're referred to as brown and green, but don't take that literally, because brown doesn't mean that it looks brown. Yes, many of those carbon-rich, like sawdust is quite carbon-rich. Wood chips are as well. Tree leaves are carbon-rich. The green could be kitchen scraps. Any kitchen scraps are considered green because they're high nitrogen. What you don't want to do is put just kitchen scraps in your compost. It becomes a stinky mess. Okay? So if you add it, and if you mix in these other carbon-rich materials, it'll allow some air to enter for one thing, and it's the right balance of nutrients for those microbes to work on. So in this case, they're putting in the plants before they even put in the top layer of, say, compost and mulch and all that. I hope that they've done their planning well, because the number one mistake that people make is planting too closely. Think about what the spread is going to be of your tree or shrub or what have you, and at maturity, and you have to do the research and know just how big is that tree or shrub going to get, because you don't want trees and shrubs and other vegetation overlapping unless you have shade-tolerant plants. And the advantages of sheet mulching. Basically, the bottom line is it improves plant vigor and health. And it's going to cut down on your work and costs too, hopefully. So here we have, you can call this a permablitz. It's similar to an old-fashioned barn raising when people get together and help each other out. And what better way to spend a good part of a day and just make what might seem to be work into something that's actually an occasion for celebration, cooperation, getting to know each other, sharing not only labor, but also perhaps plants, recipes. That's the wonderful thing about perennials, by the way. They make copies of themselves very well. And so that if you grow perennials, then you can divide them and give other people some and, share the wealth, right? And they might even share their tools, their expertise. They might have potlucks, right? And spread the word about how much fun this is. And I think that that's going to be a big part of moving forward in the future to get the balance a little bit more in a sensible direction about how much lawn we have and how much productive land we have. Here's a novel idea for a raised bed. You could call this the ultimate raised bed, because ideally it can be up to 6 feet tall or even taller. If you have wood, and if it doesn't matter at all if it's rotten. In fact, that's perfectly good for these purposes. And you might see here on top there's a layer of turf upside down that's been, the turf has been placed upside down, and then soil. And then you can plant either annuals or perennials on this kind of raised bed. What are the advantages? Well, a farmer named Sepp Holzer in the Alps discovered that there was a lot of heat being generated by that decomposition, of that in that soil, just rich with all those microbes doing their work. And compost piles do heat up, and this is compost. So he could grow vegetables that he would never dream being able to grow otherwise in the Alps. He was like creating a different zone for himself. Remarkably, hill culture is also quite effective in the desert because water is preserved. It's like a mulch, it's like a sponge in there, and covering it with mulch certainly helps. But you'll see an oasis of green with hill culture, and everything else is parched around it. And literally no irrigation is needed because whenever it rains, that water is going to be absorbed and held like a storage tank by that hill culture. So if you have extra wood you don't know what to do with, think about this as an option. It's quite creative and quite useful. I highly recommend chipped branch wood as a mulch because once it decomposes, and eventually it will, then you've got just the right balance of carbon and nitrogen, which I referred to earlier when I was talking about your compost pile. What you want now is 2.5 inches wide branches, 7 centimeters, 2.5 inches, no wider. Because if it's wider, then there's too much wood, which is just carbon. There's not enough nitrogen there. So wood chips are okay as a mulch, but this chipped branch wood is better because it has a better balance. And it's found that this is an excellent mulch for both annual and perennial gardening. Speaking of wood chips, here's a mushroom that loves to grow in wood chips. It's called these Winecap stropharia, and it's easy for even a beginner to positively identify this mushroom just by looking at the ring around the stalk. Do you see how it looks like gears, very ornamented? And it's not always this color, the Winecap color, but this is a delicious mushroom, and you could, if you find it growing in the wild, well, bring it to your own bed of wood chips and inoculate them. And as long as it stays moist, there's a good chance that you're going to end up having a nice crop of free wild mushrooms. There are other mushrooms that you can cultivate as well. Now let's talk about trees, which are my primary passion. And when we plant trees, we plant the seeds of peace and seeds of hope. Look at the valuable and important uses, the functions that trees serve. We know that they give us oxygen. We know that they absorb carbon, clean the soil, control noise pollution, slow stormwater runoff, fight soil erosion, clean the air, shade and cool. Let's stop right there and think about shade and cool. The more total trees that you have in your yard, the more you're going to feel a coolness, or you're going to mediate the temperature on the hot days that we're going to have more and more of as the decades go on. Even if magically we were to stop burning fossil fuels, the momentum has already created global climate disruption to the point that we're going to have many, many more 90 degrees and 100 degree days in the summers here in Massachusetts than we used to have. And you might be surprised to learn that winters will also be more severe because climate patterns have been disrupted, the jet stream and the like have been disrupted. So that means that the mediating effect of the jet stream will be lost in a certain sense to us, and we're going to be suffering some very severe winters along with those unbearable summers. So the more trees we plant, the better off we'll be, and especially to the west and the east. The west is choice number one, the afternoon sun. You want to block the afternoon sun with a deciduous tree. Not with a conifer though, because you don't want to block the sun in the wintertime. You want the rays of the sun warming your house. For a windbreak, however, conifers are just the ticket, and put them to the north of your house so that they will break the impact, shall we say, of the north winds, right? The force of the north winds, and guide those winds away from your house. Save on your heating bill. And all of these trees, if done well and if done tastefully, will increase your property value. In fact, one tree, if it's a beautiful or functional tree, it could be worth thousands of dollars in terms of improving your property value. We tend to think in terms of our house mostly, but for those purposes. But what prospective buyer would not be delighted to learn about all the variety of things that he or she could then harvest in the years to come on your property once you decide to sell that property. Now that you've decided what trees or shrubs you're buying and you're putting in the ground, and you want to dig a hole now that's actually much wider than you might think is necessary, but no deeper than absolutely necessary. You don't want that plant sinking into the ground The stem should not be surrounded by soil because that invites infection by microbes that might do some harm to that tree, or moles and voles and the like might harm the tree. So it might be tempting to put some of that wonderful compost in the hole that you dug instead of the soil that came out. However, even if the tree or shrub might like that to start out with, you're not doing it any favors because you're spoiling the roots. They're just going to stay in that, in that hole. You want them to grow out into the surrounding soil as quickly as possible and be extending their reach. You might, however, consider adding soil, just inoculating that hole after you've dug it and returning the soil back, inoculating with soil that you've taken from the woods, or especially from the soil that surrounds the kind of tree or shrub that you are growing, because those will be the very organisms that are going to be engaging in that symbiotic relationship that we were talking about earlier, the mycorrhizal relationship. So, and you can actually buy some mycorrhizal treatments if you don't feel that you can just gather them from the wild. But notice here the mulching and some, there's kind of a ring in this cross section. This is a ring of soil that is going to hold the water when it rains, like a basin. But notice the mulch is not actually touching the stem. Here's a very definite example of that, where the mulch starts about here and goes at least to the crown. And you know the roots are going to go even beyond the drip line. The roots are going to keep on growing and spread more than the tree itself will. Chinese chestnut. What a delicious nut this is. It's actually low in oil. It's an unusual nutrient composition, but it's got a lot of energy. You can make a chestnut flour as well as just roasting the nuts. And so this is, it's hard to grow plants that give us energy here in New England. So with perennials. So this is one of the important trees to consider. And it's not nearly as huge as the American chestnut, which succumbed to the blight several decades ago. So many of us wouldn't have room for American chestnuts even if they were available. But the Chinese chestnut, it's a medium-sized tree, maybe to 40, 50 feet. You might have to fight the squirrels off to get those nuts because they love them. In fact, you might have to knock them out of the tree. I'm talking about the nuts, not the squirrels here. Knock the nuts out of the tree before they're ripe, and then bring them in so that you can have them. And of course, you have to be prepared to deal with those spiny husks. But look at the size of those Chinese chestnuts. Even though the tree itself is smaller than the American chestnut, the nuts themselves are larger, and many people feel that they taste just as good as the American chestnut. Now, it might be stretching your imagination to think about eating acorns, but Native Americans certainly subsisted on them for centuries. And it's the tannins that make them not appealing. Tannins are bitter, but you can leach the tannins out by boiling the acorns. Now there are some oaks, especially the white oak group, and this species, and there's some others as well, have virtually no tannins at all. So you can skip that process. You can skip that stage of having to boil the tannins out, leach the tannins out. You can go ahead and after you shell the nuts, you can roast them, make acorn flour, acorn meal, and they can be quite satisfying, quite nutritionally, healthy and tasty. But it's a big tree, of course. Any oak is going to be just about any oak is going to be a big tree, and you have to plan ahead. So is the black walnut is also quite a majestic tree and has an impressive spread and height. Delicious nut, but a very hard nut to crack. And besides, not only does it take up a lot of room, but it also sends out poisonous chemicals. This is called allelopathy, when roots send out chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants. So you don't want to have your gardens, whether they're annuals or perennials, anywhere near a black walnut tree if you want your plants to be healthy, which of course you do. These Norway and sycamore maple are actually invasive trees, so you shouldn't be planting them anyway. So they, as well as tree of heaven, are also allelopathic. Another very large tree is the butternut, and the butternut canker has taken down a lot of these trees, which are wild in New England. They are delicious nuts, but there's not much meat inside that nut anyway. here's an option, and again from the Orient, we have something called the Japanese walnut or heart nut. You can see why it's called the heart nut. And there are different varieties, and you can imagine that these nuts are easier to crack than the black walnut, which requires a hammer or a vise or something like that to get open. And then there's the cross between butternut and heart nut is called the Bort nut. And compare that to our English or Persian or Carpathian walnut, which you buy in the store. By the way, you can grow these walnuts on your property too. They are hardy here in New England. Imagine growing a pecan in New England. It has to be the northern pecan, and you have to be willing to look ahead into the future to, well, let's say you could grow 4 of these on 1 acre. And that's it. You couldn't use that acre for anything else. Eventually, when at full maturity for these pecans. Of course, that'll take decades for them to get to that height, but eventually they will be. They could be 100 feet easily. Okay, pecan trees. So, and the nuts might not be as big as the southern pecans, but boy, they are still pecans. And shagbark hickory is another tall tree. It's a native tree. Small nuts. The squirrels certainly love them, but it's hard to get much satisfaction out of the kernels that are wedged into all these crevices inside the nut. I would recommend instead a shellbark or king nut hickory, which is a larger nut and more meat per nut. It too, of course, is a large tree. So is the pecan, which is a cross between the hickory and the pecan. I've never tasted one. I would love to taste one because I love both hickories and pecans. So I can imagine this to be an excellent choice if you had the space. But if you don't have the space, think about a hardy almond. Now, when you look at this tree, does it remind you of a peach tree? And that's because it's closely related to the peach. It's just as beautiful in the spring, isn't it? Those gorgeous blossoms. And then, well, there's no fruit inside that fruit, is there? It has the fuzzy exterior, but it's just being grown for the seed. And you're going to want to taste the variety that you're buying. I tasted a hardy almond once and I was not that impressed, but I'm not going to give up. I'm sure there are other hardy almonds, other varieties that taste better than the one I had. Here's the nut that you pay more than $30 per pound for in the store, right? Pine nuts. And this would be an excellent choice for the north of your property as a windbreak. It does take a while for these trees to grow, but grow they do, and they'll keep on growing. Hazelnuts. Everyone's familiar with hazelnuts. They're part of that mixed nuts that you buy in the store, right? And in the wild, they grow. There used to be more of them than there are now. American and beaked hazelnut are wild nuts. But I suggest instead, for planting, the European hazelnut, which is larger and also has, if you get disease-resistant varieties. So here's a testimony of all the wonderful things that hazelnuts can do for your health, preventing coronary artery disease and strokes with those monounsaturated fatty acids, and just the other fiber, vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, which is another way of saying it's what we don't know about. There could be hundreds of phytochemicals, incidentally, in any food that are just under-researched or poorly known. So when you take a vitamin pill, well, you've got the vitamins covered, but you may be missing out on a lot of those phytochemicals that scientists have yet to learn what the function is and can be quite important to our health. Here's some thumbnail sketch facts you need to know about European hazelnut. And goes to 12 to 20 feet tall, so that's a decent size, but at least manageable. Well-drained, loamy soils with regular moisture are ideal, but they can thrive on land that isn't good for much else, standard agricultural areas, or on hilly, sloping, or marginal soil. And they can be harvested up to 1 month before they would be ripe on the plant and ripened indoors. Again, that problem of getting to them before the squirrels do. By the way, I've heard that people have strategically placed pipes or tubing near where the squirrels are helping themselves to nuts. And the squirrels find the tubing and say, oh, great place to stash my nuts. And then, of course, you do the conscientious thing. When you help yourself to those nuts, you replace them with cracked corn or something that's less valuable to you. You pay your work. You pay them well. You pay your labor. Now these groups here, the first in each group is the one that's going to be your best um, for the best nuts for eating, and then the one after that is its best pollinator, and then there might be some others that are good in the mix and that will pollinate one or the other of the first two. So these are all different varieties, and a description of the varieties can be found online, usefulplants.org. So that is, it can be intimidating to look at all those. How do I decide, But one way to do that is to talk to a nurseryman or talk to someone who's already growing them, and avail yourself of the expertise, whatever local expertise that you have, because people are doing them in, let's say here in Massachusetts or New England. If it works for them, it should work for you. Now, mulberries are absolutely delicious. That that song, Here We Go Around the Mulberry Bush, but a mulberry is a tree, not a bush. And it was brought over here for production of silk because the silkworm larvae feed on mulberry leaves. But Americans kind of gave up on that, found that it didn't work too well here. So we have a lot of these mulberry trees, and I find them absolutely delicious. They're very sweet. You can dry them just like you can dry grapes to make raisins. And the birds also find them delicious. And you'll see dozens of birds flocking to your tree. And if you have blueberries, you won't even need to net them if you have a mulberry tree. Why would they bother with blueberries if there's a mulberry tree right there with berries that birds consider to be far tastier than blueberries? So, yes, they are a messy tree, and no, you don't want to put this tree over your sidewalk or driveway or what have you, because you'll track in the staining berries. But if you have a corner of your property where it's, you don't have to worry about that, and if you want to welcome wildlife and also plant something that gives you some delicious fruit, mulberry is an excellent choice. It can be a decent-sized tree, by the way, 50 feet easily. And who's ever heard of a Chinese mulberry? Come on. But here we go again, another oriental species, and shouldn't we make use of these? There's no reason why not, as long as we've established that they're not invasive, and no one is even suggesting that a Chinese mulberry is invasive. So, and doesn't it pique your interest to hear that they taste like a combination of red fig, mulberry, persimmon, and even cantaloupe? Boy, I sure want to run out and I mean, if I could buy them in the store just to taste them, I certainly would. But think about China, Japan, Korea. Their climate is very similar to ours. It's a temperate climate. Hot summers, cold winters. If they can grow it, so can we. You would need two for cross-pollination, though.
I apologize in advance, we're really loud.
Well, have a good time, and we will too. We're being serenaded here. Someone's rehearsing, I guess. I sometimes imagine calling myself Johnny Persimmon Seed because I love this fruit so much. I used to live in North Carolina, where persimmons grow wild. Now, this is the American persimmon. It's not the kind of persimmon you buy in the store. It's fairly small, but the taste, oh my goodness. I've never tasted a store-bought persimmon that tastes as good as an American persimmon. It's my absolute favorite. And you don't want to eat them when they look like this. That might look right, but then it's very astringent. It will pucker your mouth like you won't believe. And then you'll spit it out and you'll swear you'll never eat another persimmon. Well, no, you just have to be patient and wait till it gets nice and soft like that. We're talking November, December, even into January. Imagine here in New England being able to pick ripe, delicious, sweet fruit. In China, where they eat a lot of persimmons, persimmons used to be their sugar before they had cane sugar. They would dry persimmons, and that would be their sweetener. And I can see why. What a delicious, very high in vitamin C, very nutritious. The tree itself is incredibly hardy. It will grow in just about any soil. It will grow in something that you wouldn't even call soil, and it will still grow. It's amazingly hardy. And talk about beauty. Look at the foliage. Look at the foliage in the fall, and imagine just being able to look out at a tree that's bare of its branches, and the except for the fruits. To have a fresh persimmon in my hand now. I wish I could pass them out. And give you a chance to taste them. And incidentally, in the wild, a male is required to pollinate the female. Okay, and of course the male will not be productive at all. Only the females are productive. Well, the way you get around that, if you're planting a persimmon, select a pollinating varieties such as Zucchus, S-Z-U-K-I-S. You can get this from Triple Brook Farm in Southampton, and I'll tell you more about Triple Brook Farm later. I go there every Sunday, I work there, and he gives me plants in exchange. All these plants, most of these plants are from Triple Brook Farm. Cherries. Well, a cherry tree can get pretty darn tall, way up there. Birds will have no problem finding those cherries, but you might have difficulty in accessing them yourself. So think about a dwarf or a semi-dwarf if you want to plant a cherry. Then you'll be able to prune it, you'll be able to harvest the cherries, perhaps even net them if you need to keep the birds away. And here's an interesting variety that I discovered recently. Carbon Jewel cherry. Now there are two kinds of cherries. There's the sweet and the sour. This is actually a sour cherry, which may not make it sound that attractive, but look at this description. High flesh to pit ratio, excellent for use in pies, preserves, juice, dried fruit, and eating fresh. Has a rich flavor, up to 15 pounds by its 4th year, 20 to 30 pounds in its 5th year. Growing to only 6.5 feet tall, it's a naturally dwarfed bush with full-size fruit. And here are some even smaller cherries, or pseudo-cherries, I guess we could say. The Nanking cherry, Prunus tomentosa, medium tart, very good to eat, makes good juice and wonderful jelly. Birds will flock to this shrub, but they can't possibly eat them all, so they'll leave you some too. Every time I see a forsythia, I think there ought to be a Nanking cherry there because it's just as beautiful as a forsythia in the spring, and maybe even more so. Look at those blossoms. But what does the forsythia do for you after those blossoms have dropped? Not much. They're a pain, actually, aren't they? You have to prune them, you have to keep them contained, or else they'll spread. I would much rather have those problems with Nanking cherry, and the pruning is less of a big deal with Nanking cherry. So here's an even smaller cherry option. Bush cherries, Joy, Jan, and Joel are 3 varieties of the bush cherry. Look at the description of the taste. Almost exactly like cranberries, although a bit sweeter. That sounds very appealing to me. You can make a great cranberry type sauce or jam from it. And you certainly don't need a lot of room to put bush cherries in, do you? Some of you may be familiar with the quince. There's the flowering quince, and it's funny that it should be called flowering quince because the flowering quince actually has smaller flowers than this true quince. And so they're both wonderfully ornamental, flowering quince or the true quince. And they both produce fruits that are edible, that you can't eat them like you eat an apple out of hand, and they're far too firm and strong tasting, but they cook well, they have a lot of pectin, which makes things gel, and or you can just bake them, and there are different things you can do with them in a culinary sense. And they certainly are ornamental. Why settle for an ornamental plant that is not productive if you could have an ornamental plant that is productive? Apples can be a challenge for those of us who are trying to grow without the pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers and all that. But with some, if you're not too fussy about the quality of the fruit, and if you choose varieties that have good disease resistance, give them plenty of full sun and airflow, prune them to keep them open and uncrowded, keep the orchard floor clean, fresh mulch of compost every season, you might do well with them. This, incidentally, is an espaliered apple. You can actually train apples or pears. You can train them against a wall, for that matter. And that can give you an added advantage of cooling the house and warming the plants, in the spring, protecting them from frost, for example. Crab apple is anything that's 1.5 inches or less in diameter, and there's some perfectly edible, in fact delicious crab apples. You can make great crab apple jelly that looks sensational, this bright pink color. And think about this Centennial variety that has good disease resistance and has a 25-foot spread, but it's maybe only about 6 feet tall, right? Short and stout, so you can pick everything, you can manage it well. Pears, European pears are the kind that we're familiar with from the grocery store. You need to pick them unripe and let them ripen off the tree. But then they don't have a very long shelf life, do they? Even in the refrigerator, they start to go bad pretty soon. You have to eat them up, or you can dry them, certainly, and dried pears are useful, or make something like pear sauce, and, which I love. But, and here's a variety of pear that you might want to consider. They're almost bite-sized, they're so small. Sugar pears, or seckel pears. It'll take some patience perhaps, maybe 7, 8, 9 years, depending on your luck. But eventually you'll be glad you did. They're so wonderfully sweet. A dessert pear. I don't know if you've heard the expression, you plant pears for your heirs. But I don't see anyone in the room who couldn't fully expect to live long enough to actually enjoy eating these if you planted them soon. Of course, there's another saying, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. Asian pears. Now, once again, we're visiting the Orient, and think about, even if you've had an Asian pear and perhaps you weren't that impressed from the grocery store, there are many varieties. There are just as many varieties of Asian pears as there are varieties of apples. So perhaps you haven't had one that was fully ripe, or that it wasn't the best flavor. But consider that they're called apple pears, but they don't taste like apples or pears. They just kind of look appley. They can keep very well, much better than European pears. And the disease resistance makes them an excellent choice compared to pears. They're really easy to grow, quite delicious. They're also called salad pears. You can put them in your salad. You can do so many things. They're quite versatile. This fruit has been praised for its taste. It's called a shipova. It's a genetic hybrid of sorbus, which is the mountain ash, and pyrus, which is the pear genus. And Lee Reich, who's a fruit guru, recommends this very highly. It might take 10 years for this one to finally give you fruit, but it'll be worth the wait, he says. Peaches are certainly delicious, and if you've ever had a peach with white flesh, you'll know why I think those are really quite appealing. You'll never see one in a grocery store, because they just don't have the shelf life if they're white fleshed. But right off a tree, quite mouth-wateringly sweet. There are freestone, there are clingstone. Does anyone have peaches here? Okay. And there are plums that are native, that are smaller than the plums you buy in the store. American plum and beach plum. Beach plum is more of a shrub, American plum is more of a tree. And they both make excellent preserves. Beach plums can be harvested on the Cape. They grow wild there. There's quite a variety, not only in appearance. Look, these are all ripe beach pears here, beach plums here, but also in taste. People who do forage on the Cape say that some are barely edible, others are absolutely wonderful. Think about the nutrition of this soil. Think about how much water the plums are getting. Not much of either one, water or nutrition. So I think beach plums will be quite happy on your property. They're bound to be more successful in getting the nutrients they need there. Here's a wild plant that most people are unfamiliar with. It's called Juneberry. And right now, if you keep your eyes peeled, you'll see small trees that are just loaded with these white blossoms. And up close, they look like this. If you find flowers that look like this, you've found the Juneberry. There are other common names for it as well. Absolutely delicious fruit. I think they're better than blueberries. The birds think so too. And sometimes it's hard to reach them, as small trees. Now, I want to sing the praises of the pawpaw. Remember I told you about the persimmons that grow wild down south, but they're perfectly hardy here in New England. The same is true of the pawpaw. It's the largest native fruit on the continent. It looks like a baked potato, and it's green, even when it's ripe. That's not very appealing to most of us. We expect our fruit to change color. But don't worry, if it feels soft, and if it smells like something's happening in there, it's quite enticing. You open it up, and sure enough, that custard inside, that pulp, not the seeds are inedible, but the pulp is like a divine combination of all those tropical fruits. And it tastes like a banana combined with mango, pineapple, melon, berries. And the Lewis and Clark expedition, that was their subsistence for quite a while. They were living on nothing but pawpaws. I can imagine a worse fate. So when you plant pawpaws, you need to plant two varieties, or two genetically distinct individuals, I should say. It could be the same variety, but they need to, in other words, they need to be able to cross-pollinate. Okay, so you can't, and they will sucker and create a grove, those two trees, if you allow them to. If you don't want them to, you can just mow them down. I just sold my last pair to the fellow who runs Indian Head Farm down the road, and so if you want pawpaws, you can order them from Triple Brook Farm, and expect the trees to get to about 30, 35, maybe 40 feet tall. So give them enough space apart from each other. You're not going to plant one here and one here. You know, you want to plant one over there, yonder, and one here. That'd be a better plant. And then after a number of years, you might have a grove of these things, and you might be one of those people who, just to make sure every one of those flowers gets pollinated, you're out there with a paintbrush and taking pollen from one flower over here on this tree and delivering it to the other tree to make sure those flowers get pollinated. They're just that good. And it's another fall ripening fruit, by the way. Think about, in New England, being able to harvest this tropical fruit in October. It makes no sense, but it's true. Speaking of harvesting unusual fruits that you don't think you could harvest in New England, how about a hardy orange? This often surprises people, or even shocks them, to learn that they can grow a hardy orange in New England. And you don't have to bring it in, you leave it in the ground. It'll take any New England winter. It might be best to put it against a wall at Triple Brook Farm. He's got his right there, right outside his front door. And so in that location, it's getting more of the warmth, the afternoon sun kind of coming down and bouncing off. But it's quite happy. So an orange. Usually we think of an orange that you just bite, where you make juice out of. Well, this orange, small, many-seeded, and strong tasting, which starts to sound like a lemon or a lime. What do I do with a lemon or a lime? I just add water. And I do the same thing to the pulp of a hardy orange, and it's like a sprightly pineapple orange taste. You can also make a fantastic orange marmalade. Now, this tree gets to be about 15 or 20 feet tall. However, there is something called the flying dragon hardy orange, which is a 6 foot tall dwarf. This is my most popular plant when I offer plants for sale, because it is just such a gorgeous tree. It looks like, if you were a painter, you'd want to paint it, right? It has thorns that are curved. That's why they call it the flying dragon, like the dragon's claws. The stems themselves are curved, sinuous. This is what it looks like in the wintertime. It's even beautiful in the winter. And then you've got the flowers, you've got the fruits. The leaves turn color in the fall. Imagine growing a hardy fig. Well, this is not quite as hardy as a hardy orange. The roots will survive the New England winter, but the stems will not. So what you need to do is either grow it in a large container, a tub if you will, that you give plenty of fertilizer to over the weeks that it's outside, and as well as irrigation if necessary, and then you bring it inside, or you can plant it in the ground, leave it in the ground, and then when fall comes, you can root prune on one side, and always root prune on that side in succeeding winters, enough so that you can flatten that shrub and bundle up the branches, and then you cover it for the winter. You wrap it up, and you put dirt and leaves and stuff in there, and then you surround it with quilts or blankets or whatever you've got, so that it'll stay warm, and then you bring it back up in the spring and put it back in the hole. And if you've ever tasted a fresh fig, you'll know why it's such a big part of the Italian culture. The Italians do this, and you can look online to get specific instructions on this. Now speaking of different cultures, most of us have never heard of this Perennial cherry or sorbet tree, which is a relative of dogwood. Cornus is the dogwood genus. But if you were familiar with it, you'd be clamoring for it. Luxuriously floral sweetness of the syrups, puddings, drinks, and confections that are made from it. Perennial cherry or sorbet tree. Now how about this? Well, I certainly am not going to tell you to plant an invasive alien, which the autumn olive is, Japanese silverberry. It was actually brought over here to control erosion, and it does that job just fine. But the problem is, it's a nitrogen fixer, so it can fertilize itself, and it takes over, and it grows where the native vegetation otherwise would. So it's too bad, because the fruit is absolutely delicious, and it's very high in lycopene, which is good for preventing cancer. And you can make a delicious fruit sauce and a fruit from the fruit sauce. But you're not going to plant this. Instead, you're going to plant the gumi, which is its close relative. It too is a nitrogen-fixing shrub, and it has delicious fruit, but it's not invasive. And the fruit is so good that you're going to have to protect your shrub from the birds, which will also agree that it's delicious. So you might have to net this. But the nitrogen fixing means that it's not only fertilizing itself, but all of the surrounding vegetation when the leaves fall at the end of the year. Some of you have heard of what people are referring to as a superfruit, the goji, or Chinese berry, another oriental plant that is hardy in New England. And if you like fruit, go ahead, go for it. I consider all these to be superfruits myself. This is a relative tomato, incidentally, this shrub. And speaking of superfruit, wow, incredibly strong, incredibly high in C taste, strong taste, the sea berry, but quite hardy. This is another nitrogen-fixing shrub. It's one that permaculture enthusiasts are enthusiastic about. And we get quite a harvest. Just in China, you might have a glass sea berry juice instead of orange juice, by the way. Honeyberry. In Japan, they're paying Canadian farmers to grow berry for them. Another fruit you probably never heard of. This is related to honeysuckle. See that flower right there? And some here are barely edible, some taste great. Just like those bee plums I was telling you about. Need two different varieties for cross-pollination. They're very early ripening. They ripen before strawberries. So any baked goods, you can make preserves. Elderberries, by the way, if you've heard of elderberry syrup, it's an excellent thing to have in your refrigerator, or before you open the bottle. It doesn't have to be refrigerated, but it's great for as a treatment for the flu. I had the flu this past winter. I started immediately taking elderberry syrup daily on a several times a day basis, and I was better in 3 days. And the way it knocked me out, that on the first day I was surprised that I was up so soon. So elderberries, it's the only proven remedy for the avian flu. So that's a quite unusual plant to be effective against the virus. And it certainly has a rich tradition in both Native American and early settler lore. There's a reason that people just love these berries, elderberries. They do well in moist soil, but they don't require moist soil. Now here's a plant that's often used in landscaping. It's actually called the black chokeberry, is the common name. But you see, I didn't put that name up there because I don't like it. I'd rather call it aronia. Doesn't that sound more appealing, aronia? And look at those health claims. Okay, if it actually does even one or two of them, I'd say it's a useful fruit. But it may well be true that all of them are real benefits that could be eventually proven if research funds were allotted to proving their efficaciousness. Now, but until that happens, and until people become more familiar with this fruit, they're going to still think of it as black chokeberry, and they're not going to even bother to harvest it. I will admit that if you taste a black chokeberry right out of the bush, you're not very impressed. You're not likely to have more than one. But if you bring them in and put them in a bag and freeze that bag in your freezer, and then take them out, and whatever you want to do. There's a book called A is for Aronia, of all the different things you can do, but the first thing you have to do is freeze them. And then once you've thawed them, I put them in my 7-grain cereal. There's a hot cereal that I eat routinely for my morning breakfast. I put those aronia berries in it. They're delicious. And you can see why it's an appealing landscaping plant. Look at that foliage in the fall. You've got the leaves and the berries looking great. And the white flowers in spring. all year through. It's just a beautiful plant. It's a shrub. And we certainly know about blueberries being delicious, and there's the high bush, there's the low bush, there's the mid-season, early season, mid-season, late season, if you want to extend your harvesting of blueberries. And speaking of landscaping, why wouldn't you want to plant this and feature it in your landscape with such a statement in the fall foliage as this? Did you know that you could grow cranberries and don't need a bog to grow them? The reason cranberries are grown in bogs, other plants can't stand a bog, but cranberries can. So you can grow cranberries. You can also grow its relative, the lingonberry, which grows in Sweden. Swedes love lingonberries. They make preserves. Look at the health claims for lingonberry. You'll understand why: omega-3 fatty acids, unsaturated fats, on and on and on. And how's this? Can be kept for months at room temperature simply by placing it in jars of water. That's a pretty useful berry to have, I'd say. Lingonberry. Now, there are many viburnums that have edible fruit. You might be more inclined, though, to be planting these for wildlife than for your own consumption, because you're just not going to get impressive harvests of many berries. You know, they're fairly small. I have one of these left because the fellow at Indian Head Farm bought my other. These yellow raspberries are twice the size of a typical red raspberry, and they're going to ripen later in the fall. So you can extend your harvest of raspberries and blackberries with this yellow, and perhaps the birds won't even recognize this as being ripe because they're not expecting the yellow berry to be ripe. And the sweet taste is certainly something that's appealing as well. I also have some Caroline red raspberries, which, as you can see by the press here, I've quoted different internet sources, it's the best. A rich, full, intense flavor, tolerates drought, heat, no disease, big flavorful berries, leaf coming and coming, spreads very quickly, at least twice as vigorous as Heritage, which is the standard for red raspberries. And I also have some Bristol black raspberries, the best tasting according to Stark Brothers Nursery. They don't require staking, self-pollinating, large, firm, and gorgeous. The Jewel is another variety that's come and recommended. And then there's the Triple Crown Thornless, something else that I'm offering today. And I acquired these through the sweat of my own brow because I helped a friend. Her garden was going way beyond, the bittersweet and everything else that the staghorn sumac. I mean, it had been years since these things were tackled. And in exchange for my labor, she let me harvest a lot of these volunteer Triple Crown Thornless blackberries and Caroline red raspberries and Bristol black raspberries. That's, as I mentioned earlier, perennials are great at making copies of themselves, so that they'll either spread by runners, or the canes will dip over. They'll bend over and they'll plant themselves right into the soil or into the lawn. Wherever their tips touch the lawn. So it's like magic. Imagine getting 30 pounds or more of blackberries per plant and not having to worry about those vicious thorns that you deal with when you're trying to pick wild blackberries. And there's some gourmet strawberries that might tempt you. Mar de Bois is rated the best strawberry of them all. It's not as big as your typical strawberry, but it makes up for it in taste. As close to perfection as I've ever found, says Dave's Garden. There's also musk. Imagine something that tastes like strawberry, raspberry, and pineapple. The musk strawberry. If you go to a French restaurant, they'll serve these for dessert, either a Mar de Bois or a musk, or one of these, the Alpine strawberry, which does not send out runners, by the way, and it's just as sweet as a wild strawberry. If you've ever had a wild strawberry, you know how good that is. The same can be said of the white woodland strawberry. Wonderfully sweet. This one does send runners. So there are some cases in which you want your strawberries to send out runners, others cases in which you don't want them to. You have that choice. So there they are, the 4 gourmet strawberries: the Mar de Bois, the musk, the white woodland, and the alpine. If you've never tasted a hardy kiwi fruit before, let me tell you, you're in for a treat. Hopefully you will someday. This is one of those things you got to do. Next chance you find. I don't really care for kiwis that you buy in the store. I don't, the fuzzy, exterior, of course, is not edible. But I don't like the inside either. But the inside, not particularly. But these kiwis, yes, there's a kind of suggestion of kiwi there, but there's also this wonderful pineapple sweetness that makes it much more palatable to me, much more delicious. And you just pop it in your mouth like a grape. You don't have to, there's the seeds are tiny and perfectly edible, and there's no inedible rind to it. So what we're talking about here is a very vigorous vine, and you need a male. There are no self-pollinating hardy kiwis, so you need a male vine, hardy kiwi vine, for the male flowers, and that one will be able to pollinate several other females. But even to plan to have one female vine, it'll get as big as it possibly can get. Think about a wild grape out in the woods that makes a big trunk, right? You've seen those huge trunks, and they'll go way up into the tops of the trees. That's exactly what a hardy kiwi will do if you let it. And that you might, in fact, choose to let the male do that because he won't need to reach those flowers. The flowers are there to pollinate the females. But what you do want to do with your female plant is create either a trellis or train it on a fence, someplace where you'll be able to reach all those delicious fruits, and someplace where you'll be able to prune, which you will eventually have to commit to doing. Because when it's gotten as big as you can allow it to get, if you run out of space for it or run out of trellis or whatever, then you have to prune it at least 2 or 3 times a year, because this is a vigorous vine that keeps on going. Here's something called the super hardy kiwi that has attractive foliage as well and grows farther north than this one, but they both grow just fine here in the Midland. And as you can see, there are a lot of varieties. We're all familiar with grapes, and in my mind, there's nothing wrong with grapes having seeds. If they taste better than seedless, I don't mind messing with the seeds myself. Concord can certainly be delicious grapes, so can Stuyven. Flavor is fruity and with a spicy character. Chocolate vine. Now this doesn't taste like chocolate, let me assure you. It actually tastes more like tapioca. Here's a fruit that opens itself. It's on the vine. And the seeds are not edible, but the fruit is. It tastes like tapioca. Schisandra. In China, they know this well. And for centuries, they have been prescribing the fruit of the Schisandra vine for the following. Okay, now look at this first one. Adaptogen. Have you ever heard of this word, adaptogen? For increasing resistance to disease and stress, increasing energy, increasing physical performance and endurance, and yes, they do feed it to their Olympic athletes. Okay? Reflex responses, mental alertness, early aging, prevents early aging, increases lifespan, on and on. Normalizing blood sugar, immune system, speeds recovery after surgery. What does this plant, what does this berry not do? A woman who told me that she grows this vine on her property said that she dries them and she sells all that she can provide. Her entire harvest. She sells them easily to health food stores. It's called the 5-flavor fruit. And the 5 flavors are sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, I think is the other one. All 5 at once. So when you eat one of these berries, pop in your mouth, you know you're eating something. It's not going to be simply sweet. And for that reason, it's not going to be the kind of berry that you kind of keep popping in your mouth. However, you can do wonderful things with it. You can put it in your smoothies, for example, and then it'll taste great. I'm wondering, by the way, does anyone here make smoothies? Do you know what I mean when I say smoothie? A blended drink that usually has like banana, or, maybe orange juice, or, but you can put surprising things in a smoothie. You can put greens in there that you otherwise have to cook, but you don't have to cook, like kale or something. But you don't have to cook them if you put them in a smoothie. So they can be just chock full of nutrients. So rose hips are edible, full of vitamin C. They grow wild on the Cape. You can dry them for rosehip tea. You can make rosehip preserves. Certainly a beautiful shrub. Now, when we think about edible perennial vegetables, and by the way, that fellow Eric Tonesmeyer, remember the co-author of the Paradise Lot book that I was telling you about? that lives in Holyoke. Those two are the guys who specialize in edible perennial vegetables. Jonathan Bates has a permaculture nursery, and you'll see it on this handout. It's listed on this handout that I'm going to give you at the conclusion of the program, which is accessible at my website, johnroot.net. And if you select edible perennial gardening and landscaping, in that program description, you'll see the word handout in blue underlined. Click on that, and there's that document. So, permaculture nursery, Jonathan Bates, he grows a lot of these and sells a lot of these plants, and will ship them. And Eric Tonesmeyer wrote the book about them, literally. It's called Edible Perennial Vegetables, and if you do a search online for his name, Tonesmeyer, and the name of any edible perennial vegetable that you're curious about, let's say it's, rhubarb, you know about it, and let's say it's ostrich fern, you can learn all about it. That part of his book is, in other words, his whole book is online. If you just select the vegetable you're curious about, it'll bring up those pages. Now let's go back here for a second, and I wanted to show you the daylilies. 95% of us can eat the daylily buds, and the day after, the blooms when they wrap up like that, after they've bloomed. And it's too late now to be harvesting the greens, but early in the spring, you can eat them raw or put them in a stir fry or what have you. However, 5% of the population has a disagreeable reaction. So the first time you try anything that's a daylily, whether it's a flower or a shoot, try a little bit, try it in moderation. And if you feel a little bit unwell, then okay, you're one of the 5%. But the rest of us, you're not going to have this allergic reaction. It's more like just, some people, it just doesn't settle well, if you know what I mean. All right, so, but for those of us who are fortunate enough to be the 95%, it's delicious. I highly recommend trying it out daily, but either the flowers or the greens. Now, this is also delicious, the fiddleheads of the ostrich fern, but it has to be the ostrich fern. It can't be any other fern. Okay, there is no other fern that you can eat the fiddleheads of. Now, with a description like this, where we're seeing that they taste earthy like tree ear mushrooms, even savory or meaty, satisfyingly crunchy, sometimes chewy. Saute them with olive oil, garlic, and shallots. Sounds good to me. All right, so it's a large, handsome fern, with very tall fronds, and it's a perennial. It'll spread. In the wild, you find them near rivers or in seasonally flooded areas, but you can grow them just fine out in the open. In fact, they'll be quite happy to be out, to be getting full sun as long as they have decent irrigation, Or in fact, because they're perennials, as we've already learned, they'll survive drought better than your annual bed. And in fact, they'll spread, right? So your ostrich fern bed can become larger and larger each year, and you can be harvesting more of the fiddleheads. And if you harvest them, they'll come right back. Jerusalem artichoke. Here's another potentially important plant for the future to be able to grow something that will give you energy here in New England. It's a tall, sunflower-like plant. It's a close relative of sunflower. So think about, 10 feet easily. These plants can get quite tall. The flowers aren't as large as sunflower flowers, but that's not why you're growing it. You're growing it for these tubers that you can harvest, especially in the spring. That's when they taste great. Now, tubers have inulin, the sunflower tubers, and Jerusalem sunflower, Jerusalem artichoke. Sometimes they're called sunchoke. They're not from Jerusalem. They're not artichokes, but that's just the common name they got stuck with. But you can eat them raw. They taste like water chestnuts. You can also treat them like potatoes. You can fry them. You can bake them, boil them, whatever. Make soups or stews. The sky's the limit, or your kitchen is the limit. Your culinary imagination. I highly recommend these sunchokes. The one thing that people don't like about them sometimes is that they can be invasive. They can spread. Don't put them anywhere near your annual garden. Just give them place all to themselves, in other words, because they're going to spread, and it's hard to get rid of them. Giant Solomon seal. The shoot is edible in the spring, just like asparagus shoots. And in fact, it's perhaps it's the root. I'm not sure which part of the plant, which is supposed to be so wonderful for any injuries to the musculoskeletal system, according to Jim McDonald, who is an herbal expert. Here's a plant that grows, believe it or not, to 14 feet every year, a perennial. But you chop it down before it gets to that height if you're wanting to harvest it, maybe the first foot or so. It's called udo. I've never seen it, never tasted it, but I feel obliged to include it in my presentation because maybe you're a pioneer and you're going to get it before I do. All of these, you just do your research on, look online. The World Wide Web is a wonderful thing. Sweet Sicily. Every part of the plant is sweet, especially the seeds, which have a licorice type sweetness to them. And how about a plant that has such large leaves that children can hide under them? That's the giant Japanese butterbird. The sweet coltswood is a different variety, it's smaller, but you can harvest the leaf stalks in the spring. And how about a large perennial celery? I see some of you are familiar with this. It doesn't taste exactly like celery. In fact, it might even taste better for some purposes, in your soup or stew. Bamboo is an edible perennial, isn't it? Bamboo shoots are edible. Of course, this is another plant that can be quite invasive. It can be, the running bamboo can. If it's a clumping bamboo, it's not invasive, but then it's not edible. So if you want to eat them, you have to get a running bamboo. Of course, you can always keep it in check by mowing or by growing against a woods margin because the bamboo cannot grow into the woods. It just can't grow in the shade. Good King Henry is a perennial from Britain that tastes like spinach. The young flowers can also be cooked like broccoli. The seeds can be used like poppy seeds. It's a versatile plant. Dandelion happens to be one of my favorite vegetables. And doesn't it make sense to get good varieties? See, the wild variety, I love it, but it goes to flower and then it becomes too bitter. So wouldn't it be great to have dandelion all into the growing season? You'd be able to, greens that are bred for that purpose. And it's hard to think of a more healthy, here again, I'm giving you long lists of virtues of these plants. It seems like every one of these is not just a delicious food, but a very healthy food. It's almost like medicine or a miracle drug. These are uses, by the way, of either the roots or the greens, this list you see here. You'd have to know which one in terms of the condition that you're hoping to address. But some chicory is perennial. Look it up online, Eric Tone's Iron Chicory, and you'll see a description of the varieties that are edible. And in salads and gourmet dishes. And how about this plant growing on the rocky coast of England? That's a pretty challenging habitat, wouldn't you say, for a plant to grow in? Sea kale. And Mark Williams, who's a forager of wild plants in Britain, says he places it on a par with ceps, scallops, and truffles. Well, that's a high compliment to make if you're a Brit. So they can be cooked like asparagus. Flower buds knock the spots off purple sprouting broccoli. In other words, Jonathan Bates calls this a broccolita. And the broccoli would be ripe, ready to harvest much sooner than the broccoli that we're familiar with. The stems taste mildly of pea and cabbage, combines with the sweetness of the blossoms. The fruits look like peas and taste like cabbage. So this is another versatile plant. And how about Turkish rocket, another broccolita that Jonathan Bates has in stock. Flowering heads are mustardy broccoli, younger leaves eaten raw or cooked, or the older leaves cooked as mustard greens. No other perennial edible is anywhere near as productive so early in the season as climbing spinach. So you would need a decent trellis, as you can see, for climbing spinach. But imagine the productivity that you get just from one plant or one little area of this climbing spinach. I do have some garden sorrel available. French sorrel is quite popular in Europe. Sorrel soup is a favorite. You can have them also in your salad. The leaves are lemony, high in nutrients. Salads, soups, and stews. Stinging nettle is actually one of my favorite plants, believe it or not. You have to get them early in the spring. And this too has a long list of health uses. But most people would hesitate before actually planting stinging nettle on their property. If you can find them in the wild, perhaps that's the better choice. I have a pot of comfrey if someone would like to make a good home for this. I do want to give you a word of warning, though, that comfrey has a way of establishing itself to the point where it's impossible to get rid of it. You know, if you try to dig it up, even if there's a small piece of root still in the soil, well, that piece will grow another plant, etc. But look at the reason why you might want to grow comfrey as a green manure. Look at the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium content of comfrey leaves compared to manure, and you'll see that 1.8 for nitrogen exceeds anything except rabbit manure. The 0.5 for phosphorus exceeds anything except for chicken manure, and the potassium far exceeds any of the manures. 5.3 compared to, not 0.9 being the highest for sheep manure. They're also full of silica, calcium, iron, and magnesium. In short, they're going to make those soil microbes and the plants themselves very happy. You're going to be adding to it's called the chop and drop method. You cut off, everything except the top, except the bottom 2 inches of the plant, and those leaves, of course, will decompose, and that's your green manure. You can use it for mulch, or you could even put it in your compost pile as a compost activator. And by the way, nettle is also good for this. There's some magic that happens when you put either comfrey or nettle in a compost pile. It really gets it going. You can also make compost teas out of comfrey or stinging nettle. You can make foliar sprays out of compost or stinging nettle. They're wonderfully versatile plants. Groundnut could be another important energy source in our diets in the future. In fact, the first winter that the Pilgrims were here, they survived because of groundnuts. And I'm a direct descendant of John Alden. That's my middle name, Alden. So he was my great to the 13th power grandfather. John Alden came over in the Mayflower. 16% protein in these. Wonderfully tasty. And it's a legume, so they too fix atmospheric nitrogen, so they're also improving the fertility of the soil as they're making these wonderfully delicious and nutritious tubers. Speaking of tubers, how about some salsify? You can even eat the leaves. They're tender with a cucumber-like flavor. Excellent as a major salad ingredient. And the roots taste like artichokes, according to this source. How about skirret? That tastes like a nutty potato or a mixture of carrot and licorice. So just imagine, adding to your palette of vegetables with these perennials. Wouldn't it be great to have these to bring into your kitchen as well? And this one is also versatile. The young shoots are good in salads, soups, and stews. How about this Chinese yam? Oh my gosh, look at the size of that tuber. Tastes like baked potatoes and crisps. Mint root has a pleasant, delicate flavor. Look at those little, they look like seashells, don't they? Those tubers, even though it's a mint, they don't taste minty because they're tubers, not leaves. And this actually, when you think about a ground cover that covers over, that prevents other plants from growing and invading, ground covers do that very well. Well, this can be thought of as a ground cover because it's a competitive plant. Just because it's tall doesn't mean that it can't do the same job of it. And in fact, Jerusalem artichokes at 10 feet tall, they will also keep weeds out. They're so successful, they're so vigorous that nothing can grow inside the stand of Jerusalem artichoke. So Chinese or in Oriental cultures, this mint root or Chinese artichoke is quite popular. I have Egyptian onion. You can see how it walks. Those bulblets sprout, and then new stalks sprout them also, on and on, and then they just bend over from their own weight, and then those bulblets will plant themselves. So in the spring, you can be harvesting this delicious onion. And here's another delicious spring onion, the Welsh onion, mild, sweet flavor, used in salads or cooked dishes. Stems used like leeks, bulbs used as shallots or small onions. And I think they're absolutely beautiful from a landscaping perspective. Look at those, gorgeous blue-green tubular-shaped leaves, the flowers that are irresistible to bees. They are wonderful at spreading, and they can also spread from seed. And then there's some other perennial onions, the multiplier onions, chives, garlic chives. I have some of these available. And look at how versatile they are. And garlic is perennial. Wild leek, I have some of these, and this is my favorite onion. It's the best in the world, and Eric Tonesmeyer agrees. You know, look up his description in his book about edible perennial vegetables, and he sings the praises of wild leeks. There's a reason why down south, it's also called ramps. They have a ramps festival every year when it's time to pick wild leeks. They're not nearly as common in our woods here, but if you plant them out in the open, they'll be just happy. They don't require shade, is what I'm saying. They'll grow in the shade. In fact, that's where they occur in the wild, but they will grow even more vigorously with sun. And the last slide I hear is of a ground cover that also happens to be culinary, wild thyme. There are many varieties of thyme that do quite well as ground covers. So I want to close just to remind you that when it comes to food, we should count everybody in, shouldn't we? No one should go hungry. No man, woman, or child should go hungry. We have the means to grow on so much land that can be productive. So let's do what needs to be done. Thank you so much in advance for what you're going to do to improve the quality of our planet and preserve and safeguard life in the future. Care for the earth, fair share, and care for people are the permaculture principles, which I think we can all agree are important. And thanks for coming.
Thank you.